Okay, so today we're going to talk about Song of Songs, which on first reading might seem like a slightly unusual poem for Wilfred Owen, particularly in terms of its content. But hopefully by the end of this video we'll appreciate that in fact in terms of the technical aspects of the poem, it is in fact hugely significant in the development of Owen's writing style. As with many of the poems we've studied, the title of this poem is significant, and we'll start there in terms of looking to lead into our understanding. So Song of Songs is in fact the name of a book in the first part of the Bible, in the Old Testament of the Bible. And knowing, as we do, that a lot of Owen's early poetry is full of biblical references, this would seem to be significant. The book in the Bible, Song of Songs, is about physical love, and it's narrated through the voice of both a female and a male narrator. So given that, we can perhaps expect the poem already, upon reading only the title, to be a poem about love. As well as that, in the biblical chapter Song of Songs, it's unusual in that it's one of the only perhaps the only actually section of the Bible or book of the Bible which does not refer to God or to Yahweh a single time. And this poem, I suppose, is similar in the fact that while it was written at Craiglockhart Hospital, it does not refer to the war a single time. There's no reference here to fighting or to battle, and to some of the concerns that we see dominate Owen's poetry from this time onwards. And perhaps that would be another reason for him choosing this title and choosing this biblical reference, in the sense that he is not referring to perhaps the subject that dominates his concerns the most. Moving on from the title, the next thing that we would notice is that the poem is broken into 4 stanzas, each consisting of 3 lines. Now the 4 stanzas become important when we see that they're ordered in terms of subject. We begin by talking about the morning, we then move on to the day, then the evening, and then finally the night time. And what this is, and we should recognise, is fairly typical Romanticist imagery, in the sense of him using a regular cycle of nature and comparing that to something human, which in this case is love. And not only is he talking about the daytime here, but he also begins in the opening stanza talking about the springtime, which means that we might also see the cycle of spring, summer, autumn and winter within this poem. The effect, I suppose, of mimicking these cycles is perhaps to suggest that love itself, as with the days and as with the seasons, is everlasting, is something that will keep on going, but that can change, and there are different sides of it that can be equally glorious and that we can appreciate in similar ways. And as we've spoken about, this is of course fairly typical Romanticist or romantic imagery. As well as that, when we first start to look at the opening stanza, we'll notice some of the archaic language here. We have the ETH endings on the verbs, and as we go on we come across the word viols, which is a very old-fashioned instrument. The old-fashioned verb structure again in solicith, and also in many ways murmurous could be considered somewhat archaic. So as well as using the seasons and the cycles of day to add this sense of timelessness and perhaps add a level of importance to this love, he is also using archaic language, which is a technique we see in a lot of his other poetry, to also emphasise not just the longevity or timelessness, if we want to keep using that word, but also perhaps the authenticity and the seriousness of his love. If we go back to the original words here, laugheth, laugheth, we'll notice that they're repeated. Now in fact, if we look at the second and third lines of the poem, then we might notice that the lines themselves are very similar. And this is not repetition, this is what we call parallelism, which is when 2 lines of poetry are almost repeated, but there are slight subtle differences. And the clear differences here are spring and love, and leaf and afterlife. Now, for me, the purpose of this parallelism, as the name of the technique suggests, is to strengthen this parallel between the spring and between love itself. So the key idea here is to make sure that the connection is made between these two words. Spring, of course, is something that we associate with birth, with life, with hope often in poetry, and therefore by drawing that parallel, we're seeing that love to the poet is something that is an equal of spring, that is able to give life, which of course is emphasised by the ending of the line itself, which refers to life. Similarly, we might notice when we start going through the poem, another technique which Owen is extremely or very famous for using in his later poetry, and that is the para-rhyme. So the difference between para-rhyme and a normal rhyme is that rather than rhyming on the vowel sounds, which is what a regular rhyme would do, which here we can see are R, E and I, it rhymes on the consonant sounds. So you have here the L sound and the Th sound. And this is curious. Obviously it's an unnatural rhyme to us. It sounds very similar, but it doesn't quite rhyme, and we call it a para-rhyme. And for me, the effect of this is, in many ways, it serves to underline this aspect of love that allows it to change, to be different, to develop. It kind of effortlessly renews itself in the same way that the day and the seasons can go on. And this, in fact, can be supported when we come to talk about the rhythm and the meter by the regular iambic beat. The poem is written almost entirely in iambic beat, iambic pentameter. We have pretty much all 10-syllable lines, the only exception being the first line of the final stanza, which, depending on how you pronounce murmurous, could be a 10 or an 11-syllable line. You could pronounce the word murmurous, in which case it would make it a 10-syllable line, or if you pronounce murmurous, it becomes 11. And that steady iambic beat, supported also by some internal rhyme, which we have within the poem, not just internal rhyme. For example, we have throbbing and sobbing as one example in the final line. But we also have a lot of alliteration and assonance within the poem. You've got this sort of the l, and l in this second stanza, for example. All of these kind of sound patterns within the poem, and of course the regular iambic beat. For me, add to this what I was talking about as being the kind of timeless quality of love itself, and along with the para-rhyme, which in many ways gives it a kind of subtle musical aspect, supports this idea that love is something of timeless rhythm and beauty. Okay, so while the majority of the poem is written in iambic pentameter, it is broken in the opening of every verse with the phrase "sing me," which certainly on my reading of the poem, I would put stress on that opening syllable in the word "sing." And for me, again, the effect of this, rather than to undermine the beat, is more to emphasise the word itself. The word "sing" in this poem would seem to be being used metaphorically. Perhaps song or verse, poetry, is the language of love, and in saying "sing me," he's commanding his lover to love him, or to celebrate his love for her, or for him to celebrate her love for him. And by playing with the iambic beat and having each verse begin with a trochee, it's just sort of adding to that emphasis on this word "sing," which could be metaphorically read as love. As well as this, it does add emphasis to his commands. He is commanding in the opening line of every verse, "Sing me at morn, sing me all day, sing me at eve, and sing me at midnight." So there is some changes to the iambic pentameter, but as we can see, it's very much crafted and for a purpose, which should hopefully lead us to respond in a certain way to the poem. While we're talking about these trochees, obviously we can also talk about the repetition here of the opening of each line. And the repetition would seem here to emphasize the scale of this love. We've talked about love being timeless and about it being powerful, and this repetition also in many ways would serve to underline that. If sing can be read metaphorically, then the repetition of this at the start of every verse would emphasize the power, the timelessness, and the strength of this love. Moving on, there's a little bit more we can say on sound. We mentioned about how certainly the internal rhymes and some alliteration and some assonance, which I'm sure you can find for yourself, help support the pararhyme in terms of giving the poem a rhythm that reflects perhaps the rhythm and beauty that he finds in love. The third stanza, we want to talk about sound on its own, is quite interesting. Because it contains a lot of what we call sibilance, which is the S sound. So as you can see here, S sounds really dominate this verse, this stanza from the second line onwards. There are a couple of S's in the first line, but from the word sees, it solaceth, breathes so slowly and low, the sense that no songs say. And this sibilance here in many ways reflects the movement of the poem, I would say. He's moved from the morning through the day, which is a time full of these musical leaflets and full of speech, to the evening where we have the word sigh. And it seems that the evening introduces this period of perhaps quietness, of reflection, where they can love each other and enjoy each other without words. And the repetition of the S sound in many ways serves to support that ending of the day, the quietening down of voices and the chance to enjoy each other in silence. This is also supported not just by sibilance, but also in this third stanza. You might notice that there's a very distinct movement in the vowel sounds that we see. We begin to get much more long vowel sounds here, which I'm just highlighting as I go, which for me emphasize this kind of slowing down of the day, which we've said the sibilance also does. We have the O in only, the or in your, the I in sigh. They're all long vowel sounds here, which serve to not only slow down the rhythm of the poem, but therefore also support this idea of the day coming to an end. And again, this is a technique that we see in later Owen poems, where he uses long and short vowel sounds for different effects. Okay, so in summary then, having spoken about all these techniques, all of them seem to be combining to produce a quite beautiful love poem. Certainly technically, it's very well crafted and was very well received at the time that he wrote it. It was one of his only few poems that was printed during his lifetime. The poem seems to be a celebration of love between man and woman, and uses romanticist imagery of the seasons and of nature and of poetry itself in order to push forwards this idea of the beauty and the timelessness and longevity of love itself. We talked about how the war is not mentioned in the same way that God is not mentioned in the original biblical version, and hopefully what we've seen is that technically this is a poem that really does seem to set the tone now for what will follow. The poetry from this point on becomes focused on the war, and becomes a response to battle and to man's situation in war. And we will see the techniques that we've seen in this poem used for very different effects as we move on into some of his later poetry.